Hola, buenos días. Es para mí un honor dar la bienvenida a Peter Cook a la escuela. Y para mí es casi un sueño verlo de nuevo aquí. En los años 70, cuando yo empezaba en esta escuela, y empecé en el año 72, esto quiere decir que casi nadie que hay en esta sala había nacido ni nada por el estilo, el arquigram era el aire fresco que todavía existía. Arquigram era un movimiento que entre el 60 y el 74 se inventó otra manera de ver la arquitectura. Entendió que la tecnología se incorporaba, que la arquitectura no era algo inmóvil, sino que las ciudades podían ser plugins, podían ser elementos, células que se iban enganchando unas con otras, o podían ser ciudades que caminaban. Y que el lenguaje de los cómics se podía adaptar a la arquitectura y que podíamos soñar con ellos. Arquitectos que han salido de aquí, como Isaskun Chinchilla, salen de ahí y nunca se podría haber entendido su obra si Peter Cook no hubiera estado antes. La escuela es muy afortunada teniendo a alguien que en un momento determinado soñó con el futuro, que luego hizo realidad ese futuro también en su obra arquitectónica y que luego creó una escuela de arquitectura. Peter es el gran transformador de la Bartlett, de una escuela que estaba en el abismo a una de las metas más deseadas de la arquitectura europea. Todas esas facetas de Peter hacen que para nosotros sea alguien muy importante y evidentemente hoy toda la escuela está para oírlo a él y no a mí. Peter, welcome to the ETSAM. We are very happy and it's an honor and we are very, very proud to have you here with us. I was telling that you invented the future and made it real, and so now we want to keep on dreaming with you. And let's dream together today. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. Is it connect? It's not moving forward. Can I operate it from there? There we are. Hi, it's going to be lunchtime soon, so I'll try and make it fairly quick, but there's a lot of material to get through, so, you know, I'm an eating person too, so I will probably see what happens. Anyhow, it's great to be here. I have to say that, and I'm not just doing one of these, you know, kind political friendly things. I am extremely impressed by people who come out of this school. Some of them have been our assistants, some have been our colleagues, some have been our graduate students, and I don't know what you think about the school, but it produces some amazing architects. And so it's one of the places I most wanted to come back to after a long absence. Having said that, I think really the lecture, in a way, attends an issue which is broader than just my own work or this school's work. It's really an attitude of mind towards experiment and towards a tradition which is sometimes irritatingly referred to as utopian. I say irritating because I don't think our work is utopian. And it is to do with the distinction that is made by rather boring, straightforward architects between the exploratory, avant-garde, arty, inventive, whatever collective we put around it, group of people, and the proper, sensible architect. And I can remember conversations in the past where once we made an inventory of all the people who had been dismissed in around the 60s, 70s, 80s, particularly around the AA at the time, as sort of arty wankers, I mean sort of, or artistes, or theorists, or painters, or paper architects, etc. And then found that actually one by one, many of them had started building. And that their buildings didn't let any more water in than anybody else's buildings, and sometimes were even not that expensive. In other words, it was a constant, the notion of separating the investigatory architects from the run-of-the-mill architects was a convenient construct for those that don't want change. And really the underscoring theme of discussing dreams on the one hand and reality on the other is that I've had the reasonable luck late in my career to start doing buildings, but I still also involved in teaching. And I still make funny drawings for no clients, and I occasionally do buildings and so on. But they're all really one and the same activity. But of course there are some dreams that are as yet unrealized, some dreams which are difficult to pin down. And so I'm going to revolve around a series of those dreams and realities and see what adds up, if anything. So the first set of dreams are dreams of the city, and I think the word city, even to those of us who spent some time dismembering the city, actually having anti-cities, no cities, invisible cities, melting cities, because we were fundamentally in love with the notion of the city, which isn't just a construct of a large number of people. It is also city thinking is, I think, an attitude of mind, but I need more time to discuss that. And so very early things, which are horrifying me a long time ago, were sometimes referred to as cities. And the plug-in city, in fact, was done at a time when I was working for a construction company, as were the other members of Archigram. And we were doing, our day job at that point was doing prefabricated housing, system-built housing. And in a way, what is not often discussed in books is that the plug-in city was a kind of cri de coeur, that prefabricated building did not have to be boring. There are many other issues of expendability and use of moving things, vehicles, the fact that hovercraft was a constituent element of the city and so on. But the underlying knee-jerk reaction which I had was that, in fact, you can have repetitive elements used in a more, dare I use the word, romantic way. I had that project published just before I started teaching. And this was rather dramatic because I'd been a young critic for about 2 years at the AA, but being a critic is very different from teaching. If you're a teacher, you become the nursemaid of the paranoias of your students. You become maybe the friend, advisor, shoulder to cry on, cynic, and only at a certain point, if they can take it, really the critic. And I never had the anonymity that I should have had. I was brought in to be a very humble person, the assistant to the fifth-year master. So, sort of meek role. You were sort of, I would go in a room and sort of be a bit friendly, and the main professor would do the big thing. But no, I had this plug-in city project published in a very public newspaper, which is read by 2 million people. Everybody in the room knew that I was the guy that had done that funny scheme. And they thought, fuck, what are we going to do? You know, this loony is going to teach us. And then halfway through the year, and 10 of the students were my age or older, including one lady who's twice my age. She was a terrible architect, but twice my age. And therefore, I was labeled as Peacock Plug-in City. But my boss had a nervous breakdown halfway through the year, and suddenly I was left, with some other tutors admittedly, administering 85 very self-aware, posh AA students. And it was hard, and I ended up becoming, as I suppose I've remained in a way, in fact, an amateur psychologist. And I didn't do any drawings for a year. And this drawing, this much more complex and I think much more sophisticated take on the plug-in city, was done after a kind of year's rest from drawing, but absolutely mental pressure where you're constantly thinking through other people's train of thought, which is a sort of training, and I suppose could be seen to be useful. I certainly think that there are many more ideas in the developed versions of Plug-in City, which in fact went on for quite some considerable time, reaching at the later stages, dealing with guided transportation and other issues. And then one began to work on projects which were really dismembering the city. Moment Village is really a kind of group of gadgets and tents as an encampment that would melt as soon as it almost would be quite useful as a refugee camp in later times. Or the Instant City, which was really a traveling circus, which would represent in a kind of audio-visual conglomeration ideas or experiences that you would normally find in a major city and would come and land in your small town for a week, rather like the circus coming to town, would bring all the exhibits and demonstrations of a city and then melt away. But as I say, these notions, and I then applied it to my own hometown with, I will point out, probably the worst drawing I've ever done. It now sits in a very elite collection and is often published still and exhibited, but it's proof of the pudding that in fact sometimes something which other people seem to think is an important work is a crappy piece of art. It's about the worst drawing I've ever done, but there it sits in the collection and turns up in Tokyo, London and New York with great regularity. So that says something. Perhaps I like stuff that looks nice, but it does make a point that if the idea is there, it doesn't matter about the drawing. Maybe dangerous territory. So a number of iterations over the years when I was in Frankfurt, and I was fascinated by the dichotomy between Frankfurt as a city and Offenbach, which was about 2 kilometers separated, that why this didn't make a real city. And I made these series of propositions that you could stick up almost brutalist, raw core elements and let the city take over them. And very recently we've been working on a city in Western Australia, which is already beginning to be under construction. And our contribution has been largely looking at the open spaces and incorporating vegetation at the word go as the roads are being laid, and also establishing things like botanic gardens at the very early stages. And the city called Yanchep in Western Australia is now actually the roads are going in as I speak. Or there are cities, being somebody who comes from the seaside, and I know we're landlocked here in Madrid, and you only have a river that hardly one notices. But water is if you are a seaside person, you crave for the edges of water, and it forces you to congeal the speculative pieces of the city. This is a kind of doodle. This is really a kind of cartoon. It is not a project. I started in the middle and kept drawing till I reached the edge and then coloured the water in, and now there it was. It's a kind of, it's a way of exercising things. There may well be bits and pieces in there that crop up in an actual, more identifiable project, or even here and there, if you look very carefully, things crop up in an actual building project. And I think one needs these exercises just to sort of, it's almost like, it's relaxing, and you just let the bits and pieces come. And of course it has certain standard preoccupations of mine, such as vegetation, which will crop up later. So there's the dream, a sub-dream of the city is the dream of the three-dimensional city. I've been fascinated for years by the notion that we could have a much richer city, that instead of everything being ground-based, and then you take an elevator up to the top, that if one starts to knit three-dimensionally. I know that in for instance, Hong Kong, there's a marvelous example of the three-dimensional city where a series of escalators climb up the mountain of Hong Kong Island and hit striations of city of different types. So there are other cities that are interesting in that case. One is Haifa, another one is Bergen to some extent. But Hong Kong has the best set of connections where you literally have effectively a three-dimensional city. And some of the high-rises are locked into a high level at floor 20 or something, and are entered also at level 0. And so you get this thing where the center of gravity of a building is actually used for the interface. Or, of course, there was a terrible tradition, particularly in the UK, of horrible decks where nobody wanted to go on them, and shops would close because nobody wanted to. But still the notion of threading decks is, I think, has some validity. Here is, of course, a project for a location very near to here, Pinto, central point of Spain, I'm told, where in a project which failed because the mayor got kicked out and then the project disappeared, which we did with Salvador Perez Arroyo. And here one was playing with the notion of a hill where you would place buildings on legs on the hill and then thread the connections through at various levels, including series of swimming pools and watercourses that would also thread at different levels. And, of course, it has that romantic notion that even a small town so proximitous to a lively big city such as Madrid, that even Pinto perhaps could have its own little kind of milieu, that you could have the flaneur on a Saturday morning, skateboarding down the deck. And one has always been fascinated by the American tradition of the boardwalk. The boardwalk is a place that is slightly softer. I mean, there's a wonderful boardwalk in Sao Paulo by Linda Bobardi, for example, where she uses this boardwalk to link constituents of her community building. And the boardwalk has that, again, I suppose, seaside tradition of relaxedness. It's not a thoroughfare, it's not a highway, it's not a street. It's a board for play, in a way. And I think that cities and towns should be about play. Or the notion of the use of diagonal right back from that 1963 tower through to more recent projects for towers where one has been fascinated by the idea of not just everything going up and down in a lift and going horizontal, but making diagonal moves. My favorite experience of this visit has been coming off the train from Valencia this morning and going up 2 travelators and gliding through three-dimensional space. Not steeply, but gradually gliding and getting a different perspective on the scene. Dreams and reality of academe, of course, having been a fully paid-up joke academic. I've always regarded myself as a joke academic. And I hold 3 professorships at the moment, but I still think I'm a joke academic. I'm really a designer who somehow got into a bit of teaching and a bit of sort of inventing things. Early days, the actual itemized constituent of Prague City for its university was actually very, very formal. But I will point out that in contradistinction to some of the kind of experimental projects, particularly coming out of France and Italy in the period, it is buildable. It has handrails. It has escalators that are at the right pitch. It has toilets that are the correct size. One actually, naively or otherwise, felt that this could be built. And in fact, what was interesting was when eventually we did build the Graz building, it suggests that buildings like this could have easily been built. And so again, I get back to that central tenet, which is that, they're just arty people. It's nothing to do with architecture. It was always to do with architecture. Sometimes the notion of academe was broken down into its smallest constituent element. In fact, a precursor of the instance city was, in fact, the idea circus, which was sort of almost autobiographical, because by this time, we in the Archigram group were traveling around a lot with lots of projectors and funny things to throw ideas. And this was really just a post-rationalization of what we would like to have instead of a beat-up van with a few carousel projectors in it. It was the notion of, again, the traveling element bringing a degree of this is now commonplace. I mean, what's happened is that history has taken over. And more recently, given a task to implant a university on a very tiny footprint of ground, using effectively a stacked table and putting each element, each department of the university, separated from the next, up into space. But we won a very big competition a while back in Vienna. And our building, or two buildings, one, the left-hand one, is the central administration for the Economics University in Vienna, and the bottom right-hand one is the Department of Law. And it's basically a postgraduate university. One of the key things, the word slither will crop up again in a later stage where I'm talking about gliding around a building. But the other thing is you'll notice some dark blue patches, which are interstitial territory within the building, which is not used for specific roles such as teaching or lecturing or interlocutory stuff. It's actually interstitial space where we hoped, almost naively, that the students might be there out of hours. They might hang out in the university. We're funny old romantics sometimes. I'll come back to this project a bit later. But there it is slithering around, and it has deep re-entrance because it's a very wide building. And we call these sunshine corners. And we make it coloured and striped because Gavin and I come from the seaside, and we thought that Vienna often, beautiful city, but often very cold and grey and windy. And people put up these cold and grey and dark white buildings. He said, no, let's cheer it up and let's talk back to the forest which runs alongside it. And we'll have, and the people who work in there, whenever we go there, they say, we really like working in this building because it's so cheerful. And cheerful was the most used word in the days of archigram. A lot of architects like to be dark and grey and pious and serious. We say, to hell with that. Let's go for cheerful. In Australia, we made another cheerful building. We won another competition. And of course, I'll come back on this at the use level, just showing it to you as a sort of instance of working. Now here, one had been in the actual business of teaching architecture for nearly 50 years at the point of this building. And Gavin had been in the business of teaching architecture for more than 12 years at the point of this building and had studied in a number of different universities. So when we did this, we had a fairly loose brief. What Gavin and I would do was to be talking about places we knew. We'd say, you know that funny room that they've got at the side of the main room at Cooper Union? That's quite a good idea. You know that funny corridor that they've got in UCLA where you can look down on the crypt but you don't interfere? That's a good idea. You know that funny pit that they've got at the Bartlett that people sort of put funny things and hang out? That's a good idea. We sort of, in a way, lurched from a bit of this and a bit, sort of ideas that were based upon the actual experience of working the place rather than what it correctly says in Neufert or one of these, or something that you dial out from the internet. And it is, of course, we were very lucky that somehow we got away with an effectively cathedral-like building on normal costs. I mean, it was a cheap building. I have to say that they build very well in Australia. This came as a surprise to us. We was almost simultaneously building in Austria and Australia. And we found that actually Australia has a higher level of technology, a much better concrete finish, and beautiful, beautiful joinery. I mean, just since we're in since we're in a school here that knows a lot about building construction, go to Australia. They do it very well there. They swear at you. They're rough guys, but actually they know how to build. And then I was called back to the old little school that I'd been to before going to the which had now become a university. And they said, will you come and do, as an old alumnus, will you come and do the first drawing studio in a British art school for 100 years? And I suppose I brought a kind of special capsule, which is prefabricated in Germany in a German shipyard and brought in components, and very, very sophisticated plaster work. It's glass reinforced plaster, which is computer drawn to the nearest ½ millimeter. Having said that, there's still two guys for a week kind of making up the bits that didn't quite fit, but anyhow. And I'll come back to that again. And right now we're just going on site with another building for the same university, which is for startup companies. They have these little companies that they bring for 2 years, start them up. And this cartoon, which I drew just before I came away 3 days ago, is talking about the sociology of competitiveness within each group has a platform which is about 30 centimeters different from the next, and they're linked by a ramp which you can take a wheelchair up. And each of them then, I don't know if you can read all the comments, but it's to do with, again, observing how competitive groups operate, where they're just within earshot of each other. They can just hear a row going on in that one. They'll hide stuff in a corner if they don't want the other people to see it. And then you can see one guy's totally disorganized. He's telling his client that they've got the thing somewhere, and his assistant's saying, my God, I don't know where it is. It's sort of taking the episodes of real life into it. But and the building fits against the workshop block so that some small-scale robotics can be wheeled in and out from one to the other. And a secret project, which it's now got half of its funding lined up, so we're very hopeful. It will, if built, be our first London building. It is, I can't tell you what the institution is, but it is for art purposes. It contains 6 apartments for artists, a public room for the community, and studios for students. And it's wrapped around a courtyard. There's a plan. It digs into the hill at the street end and wraps around this courtyard. The courtyard is glass, so that the workshops are underneath the courtyard. And the apartments, the studio apartments, are on the right, and the main studios are on the left. It locks into another building. And we are developing ideas. The building will be clad in tiles, but very special kind of tiles, glazed tiles, and then links to the courtyard via a ramp. Of course, one's biography is a weird one, because early days, anywhere I went, I was Peacock plug-in city. I was almost like a man with what we call a sandwich board, advertising. You had the board with plug-in city on the front. And then, into my 50s, suddenly we won the competition with Colin for the Graz Kunsthaus. And then everybody said, he's the guy that did the Kunsthaus. So I have a double sandwich board, plug-in city on the front board, and Kunsthaus on the back board. And in a way, one found that journalists at the time would say, of course, the Kunsthaus is an archigram building. It saved thinking, and I kept saying, but it's not really an archigram building. And actually, quite a lot of other things were going on in between. But no, the sandwich board still persists. And I have sometimes told an audience, look, here's the plug-in city, here's the Graz, now you can go home. The rest will confuse you. But to me, the confusing parts, because they're always the interesting part. We were very lucky because there was a tight time schedule. Therefore, there wasn't a lot of time for the authorities to piss about. They either followed the prize-winning scheme or they didn't. And we had a low budget. We came in 2% above budget and 2 months late, which is, for an arts building, means you're pretty much hitting the button. And it sits in amongst a very, I think, unusual architecture type. It's a town full of weird buildings of every conceivable period. And it sits like a dog comfortably in the basket of Graz, where, in fact, the molded geometry, after all, is not new. If you look at the tops of some of the Baroque churches, they were already into molding surfaces. They just called it something different. And the building, in a way, designed itself because it was a rectangular plot, but with a piece that you couldn't build on the left. These old houses, these Baroque houses, not very good ones, but Baroque houses on the left. And in the front, an old iron building, the oldest cast iron in southern Austria. And what we did was to lay the building into the site. We already knew the site because when one was taking students to visit Graz several times, there was a very dodgy bar on the site, which was open at 3 in the morning. And as soon as we had the brief, we said, that's where that dodgy bar is. Ah, we know the site. We know which is the noisy side and the wet side and the dry side and so on. But it was, in fact, a rather simple basic diagram. And I think one of the reasons we won the competition was because at that moment in time, which was the year 2000, a lot of people were doing very complicated buildings. Everything, all the other projects seemed to be very busy doing this and this and this, and we just went, there it is. Kind of. We work in a state of chaos, as one of the people in the picture is sitting there, but we somehow enjoy that. Another dream is the dream of physical metamorphosis. In the early days of archigram, one was fascinated by the idea of an object that would metamorphose into something else. The moving village would travel, inflate, and stop, then deflate and travel on. Or in a sort of later manifestation of something like the plug-in city, the urban mark goes from stage 1, which is very mechanistic, to stage 2, where the mechanistic parts are beginning to dissolve. 3, where they've almost completely dissolved. There are just still some traces. And by 4, it is totally dissolved into something like a kind of scrambled egg. But the notion being that the civilization catered for by 1 is still existing in 4. It's just the physiognomy has changed. And there were lots of early projects looking at how an organization of parts would reconfigure, would metamorphose, would absorb softer, smaller elements. And to this project, which I think is still a key project, inspired by a number of layers of observing Berlin, observing the sinister quality of Berlin. It's difficult to draw sinisterness, but it's there. The particular site, which was very sinister, very odd, at the end of the wonderful Kurfürstendamm, it just sort of peters out. It becomes a funny old rail yard next to Funny Lake. It's very weird. And then, because it was West Berlin, I borrowed from the West, from the Wild West, from Arizona, and certain, this is a completely loony program I invented, where the cacti of the Wild West would start to affect the architecture. And there would be strange sort of hidden tunnels, and then occasionally jolly seasidey bits of celebration. Moving on into vegetation, a project called the Veg House suggests a triangular site for the house, which can then be affected by the vegetation progressively, moving in on it and creating hybrids between vegetation, plantation, growing wine, making combinations of loudspeaker and tree, chair and bush, very strange combinations. On a series of 5 or 6 drawings, where at the end, the drawing gets so crazy that I have to stop the process. I can't. It becomes kind of so indigestible. But you sometimes in a project like this, you get drawn along by it. You know what the next stage is going to do. And then you find you draw certain things that suggest the next stage. And it leads you into a sort of unknown, where you almost lose control. It's a kind of excitement, I suppose. There are other forms of metamorphosis, though, which are observable when you build. Is the magic moment of the building, and it varies from case to case, is the magic moment when you had the diagram? You said, this is how it's going to work. It's the magic moment when you've refined the diagram, maybe through a computer or otherwise. Is the magic moment when the first, as here, the first piece of primary structure is there? Or does it become more magic as it's layered by surfaces and completion of the roof and so on? Or people actually using it? And it varies, but I'm fascinated by the issue because sometimes, if you're really honest, and certainly you could do this when you're observing other people's building, you say, that building looked rather good till they stuck the cladding on it. Or that building looked good as a diagram, but Or, hey, it's getting to be rather good. And I'm interested in, as a teacher, I suppose, or a critic, in where you almost hit the sweet spot in the process of a project. And it can vary. Here, for example, back to the Vienna building, these 2 photographs are only taken 1 year apart. But already I have a great preference for the right-hand one, where the patina of time and the vegetation, and our intention is that the timber slats will get grayer and grayer and start to look like the woods that are across. And actually we did early drawings, which I don't think the university will want to know about, where we said it should actually be ideally overgrown. It should have the trees creeping right up onto the building. Or you can have the metamorphosis of an idea. You can take a series of probes at the idea, and then at a certain moment they will gel into something like a coherent work-through project. And here is another little sequence of the metamorphosis of an idea. It started off as a drawing that Marcos Cruz asked me to do for an issue of AD magazine. And I said to Marcos, I've always had this idea about a comfortable vegetated club. I don't run a club, but I like the idea of a comfo veg club. Comfortable and vegetated. And of course a lot of other things going on that you can't draw. So there it was. And then fast forward of I don't know how many years, and maybe 3 or 4, and in SCIARC, they asked me to do an exhibit at SCIARC in Los Angeles. Eric Moss said, do exhibit. I said, I'll do a bit of comfo veg. Now, we only had a few $1,000s and sort of people helping them, including me pulling stuff over things. But we built a sort of cheapo comfo veg club. And there it was for 2 months. It was actually very comfortable. In fact, late at night, it was so comfortable that naughty things would happen, which I regard as a complete success for the project. And then one was able to do something which normally I haven't been able to do, which is to take a piece of a fabricated part of a project and roll it back over the original proposition. Say, right, this is a cheap piece, but it's not the whole story. Let's roll it back and use the known part and move forward again with another take on the idea of the comfo veg club. And the metamorphosis of ideas back to the notion of the tower as an armature, which is then rolled over in 2 versions of a Taiwanese tower that we did, where we were interested in growing algae. using this public viewing tower as an algae growing demonstration place. In the earlier version, the algae all sit in sort of loony types of lovely pockets, very romantic. When we got into the next stage of the competition, we hardened our arteries a bit and looked seriously at the machinery that is actually being used for processing algae and its specific machinery, so it led to a modified tower. A funny dream is a dream of slithering. If you notice, I have a preference for rounded buildings that you don't go like, that you glide around them. And I once had to put up an exhibition in Sao Paulo alongside Oscar Niemeyer's wonderful ramp. It's so stunning that anything you stick up on the wall looks boring by comparison. It's a wonderful glide. It's not strictly necessary that it's big and gradual like that, but isn't it wonderful? It's just lovely. And I have done projects talking about swinging and gliding around, rolling around. Later project for competition in Finland, where the notion of skating on the pond and the bicycle gliding around. So those pink routes are bicycle troughs, which even in the depths of winter you would get this animation, this slow gliding animation in juxtaposition with the harder buildings. And the profile of the architecture school in Australia is again one that you glide around. Move around it and mosey your way around it. And of course that goes right back to earlier projects which were to do with this gliding, sleek, slithery, syrupy kind of attitude to the skin of a building. But also that one, in a way, sideways way, generated the striations of colour which one has in the Vienna building. And gliding, again, so that both in Graz and in Bond, in Australia, there are these conditions where one doesn't have hard pockets and hard corners. One glides into a situation. Don't forget that little pocket there with the tables in it is open for interpretation. Rather like some of the things I saw going on upstairs where you stand at these tables. But I think our scoops would be rather nice and rather more particular. Another dream is a dream of melting the kind of attack on the tyranny of the window. If you think that most architecture is based upon the idea of making a wall and then making a hole in it. But I've always dreamt of a building that would, or a condition that would move from solid through translucent to transparent and perhaps back again. What I call the tyranny of the window, the dominance of the window, could be questioned. And a number of projects, drawings, and then even in Graz, we managed to put two conditions where there was a little piece of this going on until the city said, hey, you're wasting a lot of money on these funny conditions. Keep to the story. But it still remains as a sort of ideal of mine. I'd love to do a building which actually does destroy the tyranny of the window. Or it can be a kind of urban condition where one thing gradually slithers into being the next. Or it can be a condition of colour, where as you move around the building, the colours glide from one colour condition to the next. This was a competition project that we did fairly well in, but didn't actually win for Birmingham Station. And an invitation by a strange Los Angeles fashion magazine to do a project that combined the characteristics of London with those of Los Angeles, two cities with which I'm extremely familiar. And one tried to do a kind of strange melted hybrid between London architecture and Los Angeles architecture. Another dream, which of course is almost unrealizable, is the dream of flying. When I was a student, there was a wonderful book in the AA library, kept under lock and key, which was Chernikov's 101 Fantasies, a book of 1930. And we were only allowed to look at it with the librarian standing there in case you stole the book. I went up and looked at this book 3 times, I think, when I was a 5th-year student. I was fascinated by it. And then, when the moment at which my wife watched me burst into a smile at Graz, was not that we had achieved the bulbous part, which everybody got very excited about and said was going to be so difficult and tired, and we put millions of hours on solving it. No, it was the cantilever part. When I first saw it in the just steel frame, I burst into a smile because little old Peacock as a student had wanted to dart into the sky. I will admit that this childish or simplistic wish dream was there to fly. And my wife, who you see in the picture there, made in Barcelona in 2015 an object in the square, which of course was not really flying. You can see the gyros. But again, she's making this statement of the architect wanting to fly. And there are other forms of flying, taking pills, skateboarding, surfboarding, dreaming. And that funny drawing was trying to summarize the way of psychologically flying. So dreaming of towers, I've never yet been commissioned to do a tower. I would like to, though I don't like heights, but that's funny irony. A long time ago in Brisbane, I was observing how the old Brisbane metal houses had been put on legs to avoid the animals and funny things going on the ground. And I thought, why not make a tower, which is effectively these bungalows, put one on top, with some variations, that you go back to first principles of cross-ventilation and balconies in a fairly warm climate. But you do it as a tower. In Tel Aviv, which is my wife's town, there is a great tradition of entrepreneurship. And so this tower, the particularly left-hand one, is effectively a kebab. It's a kebab stick upon which the different elements, the different commercial elements, such as showrooms, small professional rooms, hotels, other typologies, are threaded. And each has its own mannerism. It identifies, rather like the vertical university thing, each part has its own identity, but instead of laying them out sideways, you articulate them up the tower. The other tower is more to do with climate control. And then another love, this is really an indulgence, a total indulgence, this one. Even as a second-year provincial student, I was fascinated by Brazil. I was fascinated by particularly the landscape work of Roberto Burle Marx. I was fascinated by Carmen Miranda, the lady with the headgear. I was fascinated, of course, by Oscar Niemeyer. And I managed to, not Carmen Miranda, but I managed to meet these guys eventually in Brazil and realize that it was an even more extraordinary place. And, of course, things like Lina Bobardi's museum. But my tower on the left is really a sort of pastiche. It's a sort of quickie. It's sort of saying, I want to do a Brazilian tower. What is a Brazilian tower? It's exotic. It looks like a dancing Carmen Miranda, or it has overtones of Roberto Burle Marx. It's rather quickie, really. In Paris, a little more seriously, one was making a comment about the advantages of the English allotment garden and the preposterousness of putting it in the center of Paris. Also the relative preposterousness of making the apartments able to turn so that you could avoid a noisy neighbor, or you could look at a particular view of the springtime blooms if you wanted to. And in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, I was irritated by a neighboring building in Santa Monica, which was a horrible, lumpy hotel, a grey lump. And I thought, this is Santa Monica. It's a dream end of you know, every European's aspirations to end up in the West Coast. And then he put this lump there. And I thought, what would happen if one draped the Hollywood Hills over this lumpen hotel? It's a stupid scheme, really, but much more recently, and I will come back to this scheme, is an essay of making an architecture of a tower of fundamentally 3 kinds of architecture, one which glides or kind of melts into the next. At the ground level, you pick up on the red brick tradition of that part of London. You then go into a sort of prefabricated, faceted section. And then towards the top, you absorb the latest technologies of movable, growable, digitally generated architecture. And the one grows out of the other, out of the other. Now, dreams can evolve into real stuff. Early days, one had traveled a lot in Berlin until somebody said, well, you build one. And we, with Christine, we built a very small housing block, public housing. And then we got very near to building this project, which was for, and I think there's the odd person sitting who actually, in fact, I know, in the second row, who worked on this project with us. And it's still one of my favorites, where one says of a little town, Verbania is not a large town. Look, they ask you to do a theatre, so you do a theatre, but the real lifeblood of the town will be happening in the outside spaces. You put some bars and some terraces, and that will be where it will really live. And then occasionally 500 people will sit in a hall and go to sleep. And we really enjoyed this project tremendously. We did win the competition. And then, because it's Italy and it's corrupt, somehow the competition left our hands, and somebody else built a copy of the building in another place. It's a very long story. And here in your own town, I have to remind you that what you see out in Vallecas is a poor thing, is the victim of your economic condition at the time. And in fact, this building got up to about 3rd floor, and the crane just stayed there, waving in the wind for a very long time. And then some guys from Barcelona finished the building, left off the shutters, didn't make it blue enough, left off the sports facilities on the top. And I don't think anybody has ever occupied the kiosk. But if you go back to that Pinto scheme, it is in fact, was intended to be the built manifestation of the notion. You have a lot of busy comings and goings at ground level. You have sports on the top, and you have decent shutters. Anyhow, I think there are 100 families living there, I guess fairly happily, and I think the plans work. But it does raise a very weird issue, which is that how much of a project, it's again rather parallel to that thing I was saying earlier, which is about what is the magic moment of a project. If you take enough of the fancy bits off it, do you still have the same project? You have the raw project. The stairs are in the right place, the car park is underneath, the apartments have the kitchens in the same place. But the delight of it, and I don't mean that as a gratuitous thing, the actual serious delight of it is taken away. Nonetheless, the building is there. It's an intriguing issue. The dream of overgrowth and of vegetation. I started to go to Japan many years ago, and I got fascinated with vegetation as a constituent element of the architectural language. And in fact, some of the best examples come from Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries. And some people sitting in the front row will remember our visits to Schwetzingen from Frankfurt. And much more relatively recently, I spent a lot of time doing this drawing, which is really a kind of experiment with itself. It places a quasi-natural series of elements, a landscape that is drifting. And some of the elements are vegetated, and some look to be rocky and stony and drifting, almost watercourses. I then plant some very naughty buildings in, just to remind you that there can be implanted architecture. But if you look at the drawing very carefully, you see there are less rhetorical planted elements. You can see some funny windows and little things poking up. But then there's further than that, because in my view, the implication of some of the structures or some of the configurations are tectonic, even though they might be expressed as apparently vegetal. And what I'm really fascinated in is the borderlines, not only the visual borderlines, but the organizational and conceptual borderlines between the natural and the contrived or constructed. It's a tricky drawing, and it's one which I'm keeping in my own collection. It's not gone into a museum because for me, there's still ideas in there that I want to pick out. And lots of other funny projects that we've done, some of them even for this city, which never happened. But then other architects have come along and done some wonderful vegetated buildings. So in a way, it's a bit sort of, it's old hat. We've done it. Other people have done it. Bugger. And fascinated by the interaction of a system. This is a project for Houston where one has a guided car system, very rigid grid of guided cars folding their ways through the trees. Again, it's this notion of the systematic and the tectonic existing in amongst the vegetation. And in a way, there are analogies between some of our non-vegetal construct. This is Tai Chung Tower number 3, still to do with energy issues, and the way in which actually metallic parts are suggesting a similar kind of physicality or kind of makeup as the vegetal parts. It's not just 4 square elements, they're being layered. A funny one, this is a little funny one. Alongside. It's a dream of escape, I suppose, what I call the dream of the Hidey-hole. Some very great architects of the past, such as Schinkel, particularly in Gleinecker Gardens in Berlin, or Ulbrich in Mathildenhofen in Germany, were fascinated by implanting small-scale focal conditions within a larger-scale project. I, a long time ago, was fascinated in hiding a piece of architecture in a cleft of the ground. The notion was that you would walk along the countryside and suddenly there would be this building, not standing proudly on the hill, but sitting in the cleft of the ground. And then in my favourite English garden, which is near Oxford, Rousham, you get these weird ponds, this sort of weird, they're kind of ghostly. You imagine sort of dead bodies, or at least dead frogs, and strange miasmas happening in the mist. Wonderful stuff. And just to take again, looking at a particular favourite in my wife's town, which is Tel Aviv, I have to show you the left-hand side, which is that Düsseldorf Street is a heaving street. Tel Aviv is almost like Madrid. It's a late-night city. The photo is taken about 1:30 in the morning. It's heaving, it's noisy, it's brash, it's commercial. And you walk along and suddenly, hey, the little pink, funny little pink thing. Painted up garage. And the lady inside sells very spooky, weird shit. But there's also, the Hidey-hole can be a kind of consequence of the more deliberate architecture. When we were designing the Graz building, I don't think we really, honestly, anticipated that some of the best moments are these little interstitial views of the sky, or parts around the sky. That is also part of the architecture. The hidey-hole can actually become, almost the best part of the scheme. Or the hidey-hole can be a kiosk in amongst large buildings. Or the hidey-hole can be the assumption that that hedge is a house. Somebody will probably tell me, no, it's not a house, it's just a hedge with a funny top. I don't want to know the truth. Sometimes it's useful when you observe something not to have to know the truth. You want it to be what you want it to be. It gives you an idea. You say, that could be a house. Maybe it is a house. I will it to be a house. And I will pursue the idea further. I will start to design something where the hedge and the house start to be at one. And even in Vallecas, the hidey-holes are actually these large cores, which is an old 19th century notion, but they have a special atmosphere. Or back to the Australian building, the hidey-hole perhaps are these scoops where you can go and do strange things. Or in another Australian project that didn't win the competition, where we take the hidey-holes, we scoop the hidey-holes into the periphery of the buildings. It's a group of theatres and galleries for a cultural quarter. Or it might be an escape place, as you have on your poster. So there's dreamed of stuff and real stuff. The dreams about a certain kind of technology, or they can be the real stuff which in 3 completely different buildings, 3 completely different materials, 3 different scales, leads one to the uncomfortable conclusion that perhaps one is becoming mannerist. I like that kind of thing. I find an excuse for it to crop up. Or is it just coincidental? It's for you to. Is one secretly a mannerist? Are all architects secretly manorists? Or one goes further and one explores the juxtaposition of as many totally different manners of facade making as you can think of. Or is it a mannerism that you apply right down to the very details? So in 3 buildings where we've been able to use or design the furniture, in the Australian case, all the furniture, and in other cases, some of the furniture, we do start to have what now we call a crab table aesthetic, which is it's interlocking and it's curved and it has funny holes in it. And if you take the holes away, you lose it. And then we contrive that the holes can actually be draw handles, so that's all right. And of course, there is the reality of this. If you look at the building as viewable, it's all blue or it's all white. But actually, of course, there's a whole plethora of things happening in between with wires and insulation and flanges that support things. And so there's a certain delight in the totality of the thing. There's a certain delight in the process of the thing. And what you see is not all that you get, even in a building as simple as this one. Fascinated by gadgets. Funny things, old ones, new ones, things hi-fi from the 60s, archigram tradition of gadgets, and a wonderful English cartoonist called William Heath Robinson, who existed in the early part of the 19th century. And I think if you look at his completely stupid inventions, strange inventions, but somebody one day is going to do, imagine somebody like Pitosh doing a version of Heath Robinson. I mean, your stuff is almost Heath Robinson. You don't know it, but I think it is. And I think somebody's going to do a PhD thesis linking the inventions, the cartoon inventions of William Heath Robinson with the British high-tech movement. It's absolutely asking to be done because there is a curious, perverse, inventive, silly, what can we do with 2 pieces of string and a bent pin kind of thing, which in the Second World War was referred to as being a boffin. A boffin was somebody who went into a hut emerged 6 weeks later, white-faced, and said, with a funny contraption, said, "I think it's going to work." And that's a wonderful piece of art. I'm not normally broadcasting British culture, particularly as we're so stupid with Brexit. I feel embarrassed. But there is one strand which I cling to, which is the tradition of the silly, the creative tradition of the silly, which we share with the Japanese. And we live with gadgets. We walk through gadgets the whole time. Gadgets that we understand, we don't understand. Gadgets such as our friends in Frankfurt who made a bedroom that goes out, and I sat in that bedroom, and it started to rain once, and Gertz quickly pressed the buttons so that we could get out of the rain. Robotics, which are big and rhetorical, or small and silly. And of course, some of you in the front row will remember this. One was lucky enough as a professor at that institution in Städelschule in Frankfurt to make the canteen, and the canteen is just enclosing a courtyard. And when it's hot, it opens, and when it's cold, it shuts. That's a gadget, sort of. And I love going around the world collecting silly gadgets. I mean, this is in the great tradition of a slightly stupid gadget. And the gadgetry that was involved when we had to look carefully at how you process algae. Or in the building of the scoops, in the Australian building, we put our smartest lady in the office for several weeks on contriving how that patent German shuttering system could be contrived so that you only had 3 or 4 standard elements, which you then changed. So you made lots of different scoops, but actually used a minimum number of configurations. It's a kind of math issue, really, mass computing issue. Being fascinated by the ugliest. I mean, you're probably not surprised to see this title at this point in the lecture. Horrible, funny, ugly stuff. Silly stuff. Totally unbuildable. I mean, having said that, many of the things that one has drawn could have been built, I will readily admit that this is one of the less likely. Or the notion of blob. I love. There was a conference done about the time of the building that was done in Germany, and it was called Blobmeister. And I thought, this is hilarious, because blob is a real English blob, and Meister, das ist Deutsche Meister, and then Blobmeister. A cultural conundrum, if there ever was one. And I will claim that we have a claim upon the tradition of the blob, and there, in fact, is the TV personality, Mr. Blobby. Dogs running kiosk is a subplot here. And I was in a wonderful, weird town called Valparaiso in Chile. And because I collect kiosks, I photograph kiosks all the time, I was photographing this kiosk, top left. And the old guy inside the kiosk saw me doing this. We had no language connection at all. He brought his dog up, if you can just see it, so that you could see the dog running the kiosk, right? He knew I was stupid enough to enjoy that. I immediately sent a photo of it to Tom Hennigan in Tokyo, who immediately sent me back a much better Japanese dog running a kiosk. And a few weeks later, my wife was in Beijing, and she immediately sends me a cat sitting in a very strange condition in Beijing. And there's a series of these things. There's also, which I should have brought, which is Marion Coletti, who's a wonderful professor in Bartlett, who his first student project was to stick toy animals on his head. I then was able to send him a photograph of a guy in Los Angeles with an animal on his head. He then emailed me another photograph of another person with an animal on his head. So there's subplots of dogs running kiosks animals on the head, which of course somebody sitting here will say, what the hell has that got to do with architecture? I think it's got a lot to do with architecture. As has experiment of a certain kind. And there you see my fascination with kiosks. We many years ago, we do stupid things like, we wanted to enter a competition for which the prize money was about 500 euros. I mean, it wasn't hardly worth the postage. For some reason, we were fascinated by it, to do a footbridge in Skopje. We even rounded up Bureau Happold to do the structure. And I had the thought, I said to Gav, why don't we put a kiosk on the middle in the bridge? Then Gavin said, why don't we make the kiosk move? Then I said, why don't we put a bar on the top of the kiosk that's moving across? I mean, it got to ridiculous lengths. Of course, the winning project was a concrete bridge in the neoclassic style. But I love this project. I show it at every second lecture I ever do, all over the world. I'm just wishing, hoping, there's somebody sitting out there who says, what we want is a bridge with a kiosk on it and a bar on the top. They can even have it without the bar. They can even have it without the bridge. You could just have a moving kiosk with a bar on top of it, or any combination, a bar on a bridge, or a bridge that's I just want somebody to do this. There's like the translucent building, the solid to translucent building. I really want to do one. I really want to do this project. So I make no apologies. It's 11 years old, for Christ's sake, not even a new project. I think it would be fantastic. So I like colour. That, you can see. Even some of the parts of the Vienna building are extremely coloured. The thought was that people might sit in there, but you don't get. Students are funny. They don't really want to hang out in the university. I wonder why. But we do a lot of projects using colour, nighttime colour. Another secret project, which we thought was dead about half a year ago, but has suddenly lurched back into action. I don't know whether it will really be built, but the client seems to think it might. So I can't, again, tell you what it's for, but it is a British location. It's to do with the entertainment world, and it's coloured, as are many of our exhibitions. And the sixth version, which I didn't show you earlier, the absolutely crazy version of the Veg House, where it gets totally stupid. So I'm interested in both people and stuff. In the competition for the Vienna building, I actually included this cartoon where I suggested that the sorts of things that my friends in Vienna really do could happen in the university. And we had these spaces ready for them to do it, but you will notice that they're usually empty. The building's quite full of people, but nobody seems to want to hang around in the corridor, even though they're beautiful corridors. Sometimes you have a curious situation. The town of Gold Coast in Australia is not exactly a sophisticated town. You can see the clientele. But the task was to put a cultural area into it. Tricky, 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 without being very patronizing. And of course, back to the architecture school. I have spent many decades being a teacher. Here is a cartoon suggesting that one of my pet hates or irritations is where you get a rather smarty-pants young tutor being very clever. I question your terms of reference, Barbara, he's saying. And Barbara's standing there shaking. And Wally, her friend, who's about to present, he's getting very nervous. And Joe, who's made, it's a very typical Bartlett situation, he's made something that depends upon electronics or smoke coming out of it. And when he plugs it in, it probably blow up or not work. And he's very nervous indeed. In fact, it was art imitating life. There was a crypt. The location is actually Syok. There was Barbara. And she was shaking. Her hand was shaking, and one of the guys there was being particularly kind of clever guy. And the building is therefore built to try and relax that and to try and take into account, as I said earlier, many of the anecdotes that we have built up. The plan is very simple. An east-west street, the rooms on the north, which are small and have small windows, because that's, in Australia, the hot side. And the spaces on the south side, the cool side, are relaxed, and we allow the furniture, they move up the hill slightly. And the nose is actually where the chief of the university, where the head of the department, he sits like the captain of the ship. Sort of symbolic. And here's another very typical, bear in mind that the town has the best surfing beaches in Australia. And so there's the main professor saying, nice to see you in the building again, Jules. Jules hasn't been been on the beach for most of the semester. The younger member of faculty is saying, fuck, there's going to be an altercation. You provide them with alternative means of escape. The worst thing if you're running the school, or if you're Jules, is to be trapped. So we gave it we got away with extra circulation so that you're nodding, I know, you know the feeling. To be somebody incredibly boring is coming in your direction. What you wish for is a trapdoor to open and you can escape. So we gave them extra bridges and routes. And it, of course, enlivens the central space. Here's another case where I was making the argument for open decks for the studios. And this poor guy, the purple, he thinks if he works late at night, he'll pull the girl on the other. He doesn't stand a chance, you know that, but he's hopeful. And I managed to find, when the building was built, a girl with black hair sitting exactly in the position I had in the cartoon. The fact is that one was flattering. Don't forget, these cartoons were done at the competition stage. They were entered with the other formal drawings. Didn't blow it for some reason. And you're flattering the institution. People, of course, will be dropping in from Princeton. Yes, And you notice the sort of identifiable academic types that you get in architecture schools there. And here and in fact it has been, I'm told, very successful as a public building. The whole university is using it for weddings and gatherings and so on. And here it's, so she said, it's all happening, Kate. And there's a very Australian man with teeth suggesting that he's enjoying the building. And then another piece of cynicism was me suggesting that there's a rather tiresome bearded academic spouting on, and there's an old guy sitting in the front who has mortgaged his house in order to go and do a postgraduate degree, thinking, what is this all about, this rubbish? And then somebody photographed me giving a lecture with exactly the same hand movement. So I am the boring academic. And I like things like that, where actually life, even if it's a joke against myself. And we allow the students to configure within the space. It is, of course, a much smaller school than yours. And the various types of table are designed to interlock and combine and make different numbers of gatherings. And the architecture is that really of not the full frontal view, of actually glimpsing. I mean, in many ways, I suppose it's a sort of Gothic instinct. And on the outside, it's clean, but with a lot of overhang, because suddenly in Queensland you get torrential rain that will suddenly come and you have to dart away off the terraces and hide. In Bournemouth, it is a simple building based upon the tradition of the artist studio and the north light, where you then bounce the north light, additional north light, back on the back wall, so you keep the light level high. You only have a view of the trees, but not of people. interfering with you. And then I took the drawing, I took a sort of explanatory drawing and broke it down into all sorts of types of people that you might hope to get in art schools. People from very different cultures. People who'd had a working life but wanted to be an artist. People who are a bit lazy. People who over-intellectualize. People who have fantastic enthusiasm. Or somebody who's a mum whose kids have finally left the nest and she's finally studying art as she always wanted to. And they're the real people with the real trees. The new building, as I say, separates the different components, the different groups of people, gives them each a kind of pocket to exist in. It's a timber CLT structure. So finally, the dream of biomorphic and scattered structure and natural vegetation working together. This is what is interesting me at the moment, particularly as one was leading up to it in some of the later tower projects, but particularly that I'm able to observe, because I'm still in and out of the budget a lot, that I observe what people are doing in the digital territory, how they're producing amazing weaving and potential components of real architecture. And I think it should quickly come out of the academy. It shouldn't just be left for people to exchange in learned journals and school exhibitions. It's got to get out there and become part of the mainstream. And so that is the explanation of the top part of that Highbury Tower. And in the fact that it loops back in a funny way to the natural vegetation that I'd observed earlier and made early drawings of. So there are a number of funny little essays in mixtures of veg and constructed. This is a recent one where I'm interested in the malleable architecture living on top of the stiffer cage-like architecture. Or here where the malleable architecture is almost like a kind of parasite. Or perhaps it is a combination, it's a kind of escaped village again. Or, and this is the last drawing that I haven't finished. In fact, this is only half of a drawing that I hadn't finished colouring, so I only photographed the bit that I'd finished, where the vegetated architecture and the spun architecture and some old kind of remnant solid architecture are combined. And you can see there's almost a sort of high-tech element that I deliberately insert into it just to say it can melt from one condition to the other. And in fact, that is a piece of something where I say, I take a rather amused view at all my friends, even the most hardened Marxist, materialist, po-faced, abstracted, modernist, whatever people, they go to a village in Tuscany and they all go weak at the knees, you know. And I'm amused by this. So I say, hey, okay, I will do a Peter Cook technologized Tuscan village. Why not? Finally, an observation for the psychologist, really. Why do I do noses? You tell me.
Questions?
Yeah.
Por favor, quien tenga alguna pregunta, le pasamos el micrófono. ¿Preguntas? ¿Nadie se atreve? Peter antes estaba comentando las preguntas más divertidas y las más aburridas y clasificando a las universidades por ello. No sé cómo vamos a quedar en el ranking. ¿Quién se atreve? ¿Somos tímidos?
There's one.
Sí, ahí hay.
Sign.
I love it.
Hello. Thank you so much. My question is, after almost 60 years old, what's your advice for young architects? Like, after 60 years old, our area changed a lot. So, what would be your approach today to, I don't know if I explained properly.
Well, I mean, the thing that I didn't have, and I've been too lazy or pleased with what I do to acquire, is actually the ability to use the computer for designing or drawing. I'm surrounded by people who everybody around me does, but I can't do it. So now I'm cartooning, as it were, things. But I think a key thing that is not even talked about in architecture schools is looking. I think that we follow pre-digested information, and in fact the rapidity or the speed of being able to download something off the internet, to even take something out of one's pocket and immediately get a piece of information, has meant that we don't look at what is actually going on. I get tremendous architectural sustenance from just looking. Even almost everything you do, coming up the travelators this morning, reminding myself about, as we did in the Graz building, the magic of using a travelator in a building, the nonchalance of moving on a travelator, which is very different from walking deliberately up a stair or going, the procedure of going into a lift and then coming out of it. Even just looking at your very big stairs that you have as you enter this building, what was in the mind of the person who designed that? To have so much stair, was it to make the building look grander? Or was it to deal with a sort of awkward basement? Or was it he had a friend who sold stone? All sorts of... And you ponder upon that, the fact that both here, at a very different level, your leader takes me into wonderful panelled rooms, which I remember going in years ago. But I've just come from Valencia, where a more modern building, not to my taste, is full of panelled woods. I think Spain, what's this thing about wooden panelling? What are they trying to say? Even though in the Valencia case, they say it was brought in from Finland. So it's not even local. Okay, fair enough, why not? But they're trying to say something about how you should behave. I always feel that if a room is lined in wood, that somehow I have to sort of check that my flies aren't open or something, that you behave in a certain way. And if you go into a restaurant that has Tyrolean walling, then you can eat in a different way than if it's panelled in wood. Maybe this is bullshit, but I think everything that you see is of interest. That here you have a hall which has tip-up seats that are sort of padded, like a cinema. So somebody at some point in the history of this school thought, you must sit comfortably like in a cinema. Whereas most architecture schools have extremely uncomfortable seats, which are cleanable. So maybe that tells you something about the culture of Madrid. It might be bullshit, but on the other hand, rather like the hedge that isn't a hedge, that isn't a house, that is a house, you can get so much out of what is there. And I think that my worry about academe is that most professors tell you who you should not listen to. tell you what you should not read, tell you what you should not look at because it's not relevant. I think lots of things are relevant, but you have to use your eyes. That's a difficult one because how do you legislate for that? I think what you do is also, I think, find people who are enthusiastic, whoever they might be. If it's the local bar proprietor or your favorite teacher or your girlfriend or boyfriend or, bloke what comes and cleans the door, doesn't matter. Get an enthusiastic discussion. And just look. Everywhere's funny. I mean, I love, what are those funny lamps? What was going on there? What were they trying to say? Were they trying to be modernist? Were they remembering the old coaching lamp? Did somebody have a friend who was selling them cheap? I mean, there might be all sorts of reasons. But as you use your mind on it, you have tremendous... I love looking at second-rate buildings. You can go and look at Mies van der Rohe, and it's Mies van der Rohe, and it's like it is in the book, and there it is, and it's all explained, and you have your photograph taken in front of Mies van der Rohe. Okay, end of conversation. But to look at a third-rate building while you're waiting for the bus in Camden Town is wonderful. It's a great exercise of the mind, but you have to have a taste for architecture. And if you don't, you shouldn't be bothered. And then it's all out there, even in crappy places. Crappy places are quite fascinating sometimes. It doesn't really answer your question, but it's what I think. So that's the main point.
¿Más preguntas?
Thank you. Hello, Professor. I'm Wu Pei, and I'm from China. I'm from China, and I don't really understand, or I really can't get the meaning of being fascinated by the ugly. Maybe it was because in my country, the professors and teachers always told us to reject the things that are ugly, and there are even competitions to judge the most ugly architectures in China. So I feel, can you tell me what is the difference between the silly, ugly things, but they are really really serious. But some things in my country, they are rejected because of their poor quality to imitate other things. So I don't know how to being fascinated by the ugly things or something of poor quality.
I think you raise an interesting sort of cultural issue, and I have to be careful how I answer this, because in a way I could be kind of old school European elitist about it and say, once you relax in China, you'll start to enjoy funny things. There's a very big, I'm fascinated by the Japanese because they seem to share a very similar taste to me. They like silly things, ugly things, and beautiful things, and they like tradition, and then they fly in the face of tradition. But they are an offshore island. They were always an offshore island from the mainland, absorbing the culture of China and then distorting it, in the same way that the English are an offshore island of Europe, absorbing the culture and then turning it on its side. And I think it's a particular kind of take on life. I think, though, that actually there are some pretty shocking things in the UK, and there's some pretty shocking things in China. And I think what offends me more is the dullness, not the horribleness. Horrible can be interesting. Horrible, you can delve into it and then re-erect for yourself, to your own standards over a number of years, what it is that is valuable. In other words, you take the horrible and then you work back over it and reconstruct what is worthwhile. On the other hand, if something is just plain dull, not even bad enough to be ugly, it's just nothing, just of no interest, nothing can grip you, that is the most dangerous state of all. That is dangerous. And I think that one of the problems is, and you see it even in the countries around China, as well as China, that mass housing is a problem. Because the object that you see on the landscape does everything to avoid fascinating you. It just presents a box. Maybe when you get in the door of the apartment, life takes over again. But there's this conglomerate of dull, really monstrously dull, giant buildings that ends up as a kind of I can't find the word even in English, a sort of sickness. So I think that's much more dangerous. But I don't expect you to share my cynicism that leads to the amusement with the ugly. But sometimes the ugly has bypassed the dull, and you get into a kind of loop where even something that is ugly might suddenly take on its own beauty. It's a sort of cycle. It's a bit in the middle that's the problem. It's a tricky question, and I'm trying desperately not to say, because I think that what I have observed, particularly at the last Venice Biennale, is that there is some amazing stuff coming out of China very quickly, and in the surrounding countries of Taiwan and Vietnam and so on, some very bright young architects coming, and they will make the Europeans look very, very stale any minute. Give it 5 years. The most interesting stuff's coming out from those places. And from Australia, funny enough.
Does this mean that it's dangerous being afraid to be ugly, to try...
Oh, absolutely.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Alguien más? Una última pregunta. ¿Alguien? Aquí, por favor. Un minuto, por favor.
Yes, I was going to ask, what sort of projects are you involved in right now? Is mainly competitions, or are you developing?
Yeah, we're doing competitions. We haven't won any lately, but we've been doing them. There's one particular project I like a lot, which we will publish shortly, which we didn't win, but we still like the project, which was also for grants, actually, which is an extension of a music school. The green building is our favourite thing on the go at the moment. The orange one, was more or less designed now, a year or so back, so it's just waiting to get constructed. And then we're still playing with the Australian Newtown, bits and pieces on that. And we've actually, back to the last speaker, we're doing our first work in China, which is, at the moment, small pieces, but possibly will get larger any minute. That is a new experience, and we just hope we get paid. This is a lady that worked for us at one time, and still lived to tell the tale.
¿Alguien más? No hay como decir que es la última.
You briefly mentioned when you were showing like this cartoonist that you didn't really enjoy British culture. Like somehow it was a love and hate situation. Could you go on about it a bit more, maybe?
Yeah, because I in the last 20, 30 or more years, the majority of my friends have been people from other places. I mean, some of my best friends are actually sitting in this room and they're not British remotely. And my wife is not British, and she has a British passport, but she's not actually British. And I find that it's a lot to do with Brexit. I think Brexit has made me very, very sour. And I think Brexit, they regard people like me, who is what they call a Ramona. They say we talk about Project Fear, and I think what they have is Project Ostrich. But I mean, there are parallel things going on in other countries. I'm well aware of that there's a sort of localism and populism, which is not to my taste. But generally, the majority of my friends are people from all over, particularly Europe, but also increasing number of Asian friends and American friends. And I just feel I'm part of that world. And it goes right back to early days of Archigram. The first people who really got excited about Archigram were actually in Italy and in Austria and in Japan, you know, not guys up the street. They thought we were weirdos, you know. And one has lived amongst that support group, and the people that one brings to teach are very largely not particularly locals at all. You know, I just feel I'm part of I'm North European. I mean, I have conditioners. I'm more North European than South European. I get nervous south of the Alps, you know, because they don't pay you, or they get emotional, or like in Italy, you know, they're just basically corrupt. Difficulty sometimes in Spain too about not being paid, I have to say. But in Northern Europe, it's a funny thing, if I get in a bit more autobiographical, and then I think this should be the last question because I'm getting hungry, but I find in Northern Europe, you see, it all works. You know, you do get paid, everything works, the machine works, it's a little bit sort of straight. But I can be really exotic. When I go south of the Alps, it doesn't work. You don't get paid, everybody gets emotional, it's hot and so on. And to just keep the show on the road, you have to expand so much emotional energy that you're kind of exhausted before you start. So I like the old cold north. And I feel spiritually very Nordic. I have another lecture, completely different one, which is called Nutters of the North, where I discuss all the funny ideas that grew up originally because of trading across the sea and dealing with wind and cold and inventions that you had to have. So that is a subplot, if you like. I don't know whether if Brexit wasn't happening, whether I'd feel more British. I mean, I like the nutty side of Britain, as I said earlier, the inventive side, the improvisatory side. But I don't like the sort of, everybody has to like football and beer and kind of shouting kind of England. But then you have that in Spain too. So. I think on that sort of slightly disparate note, I will accept your invitation to lunch. Thank you.